Next bill on the calendar for the day is House File 474. The clerk will report the bill.
House File 474, the first engrossment, an act relating to data practices.
The member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. And this is one of those unusual bills where you find strange bedfellows, and one of the reasons why I like working this issue. This issue addresses the license plate readers that are used by law enforcement, where they capture images of license plates and then use them for law enforcement purposes. And when they're looking for individuals, they have really effective uses. The problem is that they also track the whereabouts of law-abiding citizens. And in this case, we have the unique situation of having both the ACLU and the Gun Rights Alliance both supported the same bill, and quite frankly, that doesn't happen very often. So what you have in front of you is a bill that would regulate the use of the license plate readers. In the House bill, there is no storage for data collected that doesn't result in a hit. In other words, if it's not somebody that they're looking for arrest or other crimes, then that information would not be able to be stored. And there's a number of amendments at the desk, and I'm not sure if they've been passed out yet, but we should probably take care of some of those as well.
There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Holberg moving to amend House File 474, the first engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A6.
Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I don't have the amendment in front of me, but the A6 amendment is the base bill that we just discussed, the House File 183, the database bill. Senator Dibble and I are both chief authors on both of these bills, and given that we're getting to the end of the session, we want to occur here on the House floor, these two bills. So I would ask for your support for the A6 amendment, and then there should be a shown amendment to the A6 amendment which reflects the deletion of the posting of the report that just passed on the other bill, and I would encourage support for the shown amendment to the amendment to get the language to reflect what we just passed in the 183 House file.
There is an amendment to the amendment. The clerk will report the amendment.
Schoen moving to amend the Holberg amendment as follows. The amendment is coded A7.
Representative Schoen.
Madam Speaker, what Representative Holberg said, I urge your support.
Any discussion to the amendment to the amendment? All those in favor of the amendment to the amendment, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. Motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. To the underlying amendment. Discussion. Okay. Representative
Members,
Holberg.
What we now have in front of you in the amended A6 amendment is the language that passed unanimously in House File 183 about 4 minutes ago.
Discussion. Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of the A6 amendment, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, please say no. The motion prevails. The amendment is adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Hillstrom moving to amend House File 474, the first engrossment as follows. The amendment is coded A5.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, when Representative Holberg first introduced this bill, she had the ability for law enforcement to keep the data for 10 days. That was amended in Representative Lesch's committee to take the data reader data's ability to keep that when there is not a hit for a stolen vehicle down to 0 days. Members, that is really troubling, and the Minnesota Sheriff's Association and the Chiefs of Police Association opposed the bill as it's written. My amendment is to change that to 180 days. And members, I want to tell you a few stories about why it's important that law enforcement have the ability to retain that data for some period of time. The Bloomington Police Department the LPR data was instrumental in solving a crime where a suspect's vehicle was placed at the scene of a crime and the suspect was dropping debris over the side of a bridge onto oncoming traffic, and it was injuring people as well as doing serious property damage. That data was used, the data that was used was 64 days old. The Minneapolis Police Department uses that data. A harassment and stalking case, that PR data was used to show a pattern of harassing and stalking behavior over a 4-month period. That data was used to place the suspect in the area of those behaviors. In Minneapolis, a kidnapping suspect was identified through the use of LPR. That data, and it placed the suspect's vehicle in the location at the time of the crime. There was an attempted suicide in Minneapolis that was solved by using this LPR data to locate the victim's vehicle. Also in Minneapolis, a homicide was solved by using this LPR data that placed the suspect vehicle in the area of the homicide, even though the suspect was unknown for 6 months. A 73-year-old homicide victim was not discovered for 7 days after her death. The LPR data was used to confirm that the suspect's vehicle was in the vicinity of the crime. The St. Paul Police Department in 2012 solved a murder case. The murder was committed 9 days after the suspect's license plate was read and captured by the ALPR data set. It wasn't until the suspect's license plate was read and captured, but 35 days after the murder, that the investigators received information that caused them to look at the data. 35 days later. They located the suspect and then was able to prove that the vehicle had been parked at the address of the 2 other suspects, thus able to prove that that person was in compliance or complicit with the other suspects. The ALPR data helped locate a murder suspect vehicle in a different 2012 St. Paul murder case within 2 days, which resulted in an arrest of the suspect. The identification of additional evidence was also able to be attained. In yet another case by the St. Paul Police Department, a violent gang member license plate was read and captured by the ALPR 8 days before he committed the violent assault. 13 days later, the query of the data was done, and it assisted in arresting and charging the gang member. The Duluth Police Department used the data to solve a kidnapping case. The LPR data was checked 24 hours after the kidnapping. It was critical for investigators and federal prosecution in that case. In Olmsted County, the Sheriff's Office, the LPR data was used to solve a metal theft case that was resolved 30 days after the theft occurred. This bill does not contain safeguards for the data, which we generally support. So it does contain safeguards that they support. However, it really makes it so that you're not able to use this data in the manner in which we need it for law enforcement purposes. I think that some reasonable retention period is reasonable. For example, Boston retains the LPR data for 90 days, while some of the surrounding suburbs use it for a year or longer. Members, Boston is important because they actually use this data in the bombing suspect case. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department stores the data for 5 years. Law enforcement agencies in Washington, D.C. show similar diversity in their retention schedules, ranging from 30 days to 3 years. And Maine, they limit it to 21 days. The United Kingdom stores their data for up to 5 years, and Canada retains their hits for 2 years, but limits the retention to non-hits to not more than 90 days. Member, I ask that you support the amendment for 180 days. 0 days is not workable. As you can see, this information has been used to solve serious crime in Minnesota, and we need to not eliminate that tool for law enforcement.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I urge you to not support the Hillstrom amendment. Members, you should know that we're talking about two different kinds of data in this bill. One kind is the kind that contains hits on individuals, which according to the bill means a license plate that has been stolen, number one, where there is a warrant for the arrest of the owner of the vehicle, number two, and number three, where the owner has a suspended or revoked driver's license. Now, everyone agrees that that information is going to be public. It's public because it will make its way into a police report. If a person is charged with a crime after which they are found guilty, after they are presumed innocent, then of course it goes into the public record and the information is public. Everyone agrees that's ultimately going to be public. What we're talking about here in this bill, where Representative Hillstrom desires the information to be available to the police for 180 days, is innocent people. People who enjoy the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. The police want to take your information, an innocent person, or at least who enjoys the presumption of innocence, and aggregate that data to be able to find out where you have been for the past 180 days, who you associated with, where your car was parked. Because these license plate readers, members, I don't know how many of you have gone on a ride-along with the police department, but normally you'll see the police officers, the good ones anyway, they'll be driving along and they'll see a plate when they're not doing anything else, and they'll key it into their computer, find out if it comes up in one of these three scenarios I just described. And if it does, they'll pull them over, find out if the person matches the description. And by the way, according to case law in Minnesota, you need to ensure that the description does match the person who's driving. Otherwise, you can't pull them over. So under case law and your protections under the Constitution, if you're driving your wife's car and your wife is 400 pounds with black hair and you are a 120-pound guy with blonde hair, the cops can't pull you over because it's obvious that you're not the same person. In this case, the police want the option to be able to track all these plates independent of the description, independent whether they have probable cause that you've done something wrong, whether or not you've registered to the vehicle. So let me describe to you the numbers that we're talking about, members. According to an August 10th of 2012 article in the Star Tribune, which analyzed data practices requests on the city of Minneapolis, about 6,100 license plate photos out of 805,000 reads were hits. Members, that is a hit rate of 0.8%. That means of all the images captured by all of the police cameras in the city of Minneapolis that fell under this bill, only 0.8% of them had given police reasonable suspicion to pull someone over. So you may ask, well, what about the other 99.2% of the people? Why should police be able to hang on to that information on innocent people? And the reasons that are given are the reasons you just heard from Representative Hillstrom. Of all the great things the police could do to help solve crimes. Because maybe you're not doing a crime today, but the police don't know if you're going to commit a crime next week or next month or 6 months from now. Heck, you don't know if you could commit a crime 6 months from now. So wouldn't it be good if the police could hang on to your information just in case? Well, members, the reason that the Star Tribune had this information is because the data was public back then. So if you were the ex-spouse of a stalker, up until the time where this data received a temporary agency designation of private, which it now enjoys on an emergency basis, and the data practice allows that, your irritated ex-spouse could have gone to the state and asked to find out where you've been for the past few months, if that ex-spouse wants to know. Now, this bill, of course, does make that private, but Representative Hillstrom wants the police to still be able to know that information for the past 6 months. And as we saw in the previous bill, House File 183 that was just passed, during the information and the debate on that bill, there's not been the greatest track record of our state government employees keeping it private. Now, part of the reason for that is it's so new. There's no suggestion that our state government employees or even our police are any worse of custodians of data than the average person. The information's so new, but we, of course, according to Representative Holberg's last bill, expect there to be a much higher standard because of the information reasons I just cited. So in December, Minneapolis Mayor R.T. Ryback said, whoa, we got all this information going out there that could be dangerous for individual members of the public. So I'm going to ask the state government for a temporary data designation. Now, of course, the article ran in the Star Tribune in August. Mayor Ryback asked for the designation in December, and it was received in March of this year. But prior to that time, of course, the information came out, which the Star Tribune received and was published in this. Now, I have to bring out one other thing, members here. I understand that many of you have been lobbied on this issue by my wife. Some of you may be asking, sure enough, Representative Lesch's wife just wants to know where he's been. And that may be so. It may be that I come home and say, well, I hear, where have you been? And I say, well, why don't you ask the police? They're your friends on this. And if, of course, the 180-day passes, that would, of course, happen. But members, this is about our constitutional liberties. It's not up to the police to know where you've been for the past 180 days unless they have some reasonable suspicion or probable cause to have that information. And I would submit to you this, members, that the reasonable compromise, if you really want to vote with the police on this, consider that the vote on this today, even if we vote down Representative Hillstrom's amendment, this is not going away. Because this technology and this information is growing by leaps and bounds and will continue to. So 2 years from now, we may have this same debate about facial recognition software from drones being used by our own state government or police, which, of course, can be amazingly efficient in solving crimes. There's no argument that this won't be an efficient way to solve crimes. There's no dispute about that whatsoever. The only question is whether or not this is an appropriate safeguard of our constitutional liberties. So, members, I would ask you to vote no on the Representative Hillstrom amendment. This will go likely to conference committee, where in the Senate bill it allows for 90 days of information for the police on innocent people, which in my opinion is still far too long of a time to retain data on innocent people. And I would submit to you that the appropriate compromise is not somewhere between 0 and 90, but how police have access to that information. Because right now we're talking about not even a warrant. Police don't even need a warrant to know where you've been under Representative Hillstrom's amendment for the 180 days. They can match up the aggregate GPS data to track your whereabouts. And members, I would just close with this and asking you to vote no. On my drive in this morning, I heard on the radio the outgoing IRS Commissioner Stephen Miller testifying to the U.S. House Ways and Means Committee about the scandal with information used by the IRS. And the quote was this: "Foolish mistakes were made by people trying to be more efficient in their workload selection." I ask you to be mindful of that quote as you vote no on Representative Hillstrom's amendment.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to briefly respond to some of what Representative Lesch said here. But members, one of the things that you need to know is that this data is available. When you drive down the street, your license plate is available. And in at least one community where restrictions are considered to be too strict, insurance companies have hired private entities to go out and scan everyone's license plates, and then they report that back to the insurance company when they get a hit, and then the insurance company calls law enforcement about it. And there are no restrictions on what private people can do with your data at all. So if we put too many restrictions on this, you can bet that other people are going to be looking for ways to get this data and use it, as is displayed at least in one other community. And so, members, while I may disagree with Representative Lesch on what my piece does, Representative Holberg's bill doesn't require a warrant to look at the data, and neither does the Senate. So, members, I again encourage you to allow law enforcement to use this tool. We can debate about the number of days. I'm at 180. Representative Holberg is at 0. I just think 0 makes it so that we can't use it at all.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Mullery.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Representative Lesch did a pretty good job of obfuscating the real issue here, I think. I don't think anybody here really questions the fact that this should be private data and that not everybody in the world should be walking in and finding out whose license plate is where. However, when people here start playing with the public safety of people in my district, then I get very upset. Some of you should come and meet the families of the kids who are murdered by gangs. Come over there, and then you'll know how to vote on this. Actually, Representative Hillstrom, I think you should go much further than 180 days. I asked Representative Lesch, he says, well, you can get a warrant. And I said, how would you in this situation? He couldn't answer me. What we need is the police to be able to get access to this data, run some programs. They can, everybody knows that I'm not the genius on computer programming. But we all know that there are people that can run those. I see a lot of head shaking, yes, not the best computer programmer. However, if you were living in my district and your kids were being shot and killed, some living in their front room and they're killed, they're sitting on the sofa, they're killed by a random bullet from a car driving by, you'd start thinking about maybe we should protect public safety, and if the cops can set up programs that identify particular cars that are gang member cars in the vicinity of several shootings, and you can stop some more murders, maybe you would wake up and support this Representative Hillstrom's motion and her amendment. I think it should go much further, but at least this is much better than the present bill, and this has nothing to do with whether or not the data should be private or public.
The member from St. Louis, Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. And Representative Hillstrom, I want to thank you for bringing this amendment forward. I think it's a great amendment, and I'm going to support it. And I think this is a really interesting conversation because typically I would be the last one to advocate for anybody collecting and compiling and keeping certain types of data for any period of time. But in this particular case, I'm obviously supporting this. And the reason I do that is this, and Representative Hillstrom referenced this in her opening remarks about a particular case in Duluth that really kind of solidifies my position on this, and it had to do with the kidnapping of a young girl. And I think that if you put yourself in the perspective of the parent of this child, whether it be a daughter or a son or a granddaughter or a grandson that is kidnapped. And I think if you put yourself in that perspective as a member of that family and think about the tools that are available to law enforcement as they investigate this crime, and in this particular case, a crime of kidnapping a young girl, and I think we can all think about the potential effects of what could happen should that girl not be found. But looking at it from that perspective, it becomes very clear to me that what we want to do is provide law enforcement with reasonable and sensible tools to accomplish their goals of solving crimes, and in this particular case of this juvenile female in Duluth, a successful outcome. And that was successful because they had this LPR data that they could review. And clearly, and I think the handout has made its way around, clearly that data was critical for those investigators and eventually for federal prosecution. So I think that this is an effective tool for law enforcement. I think it's a reasonable compromise on the 180 days. I agree. I would like to see it go longer, but I also agree that there has to be some limitation. I would not be in support of keeping it forever. However, I do support the 180 days. And clearly, members, I think the other piece to consider that if you do no harm, if you're not doing anything wrong, there is no problem here. The data is stored, it's collected, it dumps off in 180 days. If you're not being investigated as part of a crime or if you didn't do anything wrong, there's no harm done here. This is not public data. This is for law enforcement. It's a reasonable tool. I encourage a green vote.
The member from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Lesch stole a lot of my thunder, and I see he's risen again to defend further his comments. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind here is, as he mentioned, was that with the improvements in technology, we're going to be facing issues like this into the future. And yes, could we solve more crimes by keeping this data for longer periods of time? Absolutely. But we could solve a heck of a lot of crimes and prevent many if we just had cameras on every street corner. What are we willing to, are we willing to be surveilled like that? That's the question that we have to ask here. Because if we allow this, what will be the next thing that we allow, all in the name of public safety? I think it's also important to point out that, even though if we allow stuff like this, that it can be abused. And I'm not here to beat up on law enforcement, but we had an incident where one woman, her information was accessed 550 times. So there will be abuse. So we need to put the guardrails on this issue. And maybe it's not zero that we arrive at, but I think 180 days is way too long. So I would encourage a red vote.
The member from Washington, Representative Schoen.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, members. And just a couple points of clarification. I will try to be quick. We're going to have a busy day, but there is such a thing called delayed hits. They come back later after you found it. If you can't store the data, you're not going to get that information. Whether you run a plate and 6 hours later it's entered as wanted in a homicide case, and quite frankly, I don't know officers. There's not enough staff that have enough time to watch where Representative Lesch goes by tracking his license plate data the way he's describing, because there's just not enough of us. It just doesn't happen willy-nilly. And, the type of information that Representative Lesch is saying is new is not new. This information has been ongoing for quite a while, and I just respectfully disagree with his clarification of it. But quite frankly, right now, I can go and type this in by hand, and all that's changing now is that we have a camera that it recognizes the plate data and enters it. And the data just won't work, or the machinery just won't work at 0 days under law, because it's going to be stored. It's going to be stored for a period of time. It has to be dumped, but it won't be automatic, so it's going to be dumped at some point in time. And we've had an epidemic, it seems like, in the last year here in the metro area in the state of Minnesota, where we've just had women go missing due to suspected or realized domestic violence. Just flat out missing. That's unacceptable. Now, we have case law that's on the books that governs how we handle evidence, search and seizure, and we'll clarify these things in the future. But the information is already being used. Don't limit this. Let's help our families. Help me find my daughter if she ever gets kidnapped, and be able to track that back, just like it worked in Duluth. Thank you.
The member from Isanti, Representative Johnson.
Madam Speaker, members, I rise in support of the Hillstrom Amendment. I've been contacted by numerous law enforcement officers across the state. This information has been very helpful in solving numerous crimes, but they also wanted to stress that they don't just go look at it. They look at this information from these readers only when they have reason to look at it. They don't pick it up and just run a plate number in it to see if it was there. They actually have a plate number that they're checking to see if it was in the system, to see it was in the area of a particular crime. Last year we had a bank robbery in Princeton, Minnesota. Because of this information, they were able to convict the bank robbers. This information, I don't think, we do need to dispose of this information. The question is, what is the time frame? Is 180 days too much? It might be. Is 0 too little? Absolutely. We need to find common ground. I myself have received the delayed hit. I received a delayed hit on a homicide vehicle 5 days after I ran the vehicle. And then I was off for 6 days before I got it. So it was almost 2 weeks from the time I ran the vehicle till the delayed hit got into my hands. This information, by being able to access this information, but having proper policies and procedures for that department to have these readers to access that information is where we need to go. And as far as for the drones that Representative Lesch brought up, I agree we're going to need to deal with that. I actually had a bill in here that dealt with that for law enforcement use. Hopefully next session we can bring it up. But members, please support this Representative Hillstrom's amendment because it is important for law enforcement.
The member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, I'm going to branch off a little bit here and then support. I'm going to oppose the Hillstrom amendment for the reasons here is that what other methods are we going to have to catch people in the future, and how are they going to be used? And you can come up with a number of scenarios like they have here to justify the use of these license plate readers, but we got along without license plate readers before. We could have gotten along without them now. Sure, it improves the success of catching people, but at what price are we willing to pay? It reminds me of the show I seen already when I was a kid, The Twilight Zone. You remember when the little bubble camera came down and followed the person all around and reported everything that they were doing? This bothers me. It doesn't really make sense to me if the Senate has got 90 days and we've got 0 to go into a conference committee with change it around, go 180. For me, I would hope that Representative Lesch might take 24 or 48 hours, but I'm not in support of keeping this information on innocent citizens hanging around for 180 days. And how many more things are we going to justify? There's no telling what kind of spooky equipment we're going to come up with, drones and everything else in the future, and how we're going to use it. So I support some limitations on these. And the things you don't hear about, some of these cases have been solved, would have been solved eventually anyway. A license plate reader might have been helpful in solving some of these, and maybe wouldn't have got the information without them. But some of these would have been solved by just plain old good police work. So I would urge you to not support the Hillstrom amendment and let us go into the conference committee with 0 and 90 and see what we come up with. Thank you.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins. The member from Ramsey, Representative Mahoney.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I don't always agree with my colleague from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish. This is correct. We have so many ways of tracking us. When we step out of the house, when we go on the computer, when we go to the store, what liberties, what privacy are we willing to give up because we're innocent? Representative Lesch, your 0 days is maybe too short, but it's the right place to start for this House body. We are the body of the people, and the people have rights. And members, I hope we do not want to track the people, our constituents, our friends, our families, for 180 days. Please vote against this amendment.
The member from Sherburne, Representative Newberger.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Politics makes strange bedfellows. Here I am echoing Representative Mahoney. When this came through committee, I was in favor publicly of a 10-day period. The 180 days, to me, I'm struggling with. We can be tracked today. If you have a smartphone, it's got a GPS feature in it. Everywhere you go, not just your car, but your person, you can be tracked right now. If you use an ATM, you use a credit card, if you have OnStar in your car, every single time you go online, you are tracked. Someone had mentioned private security cameras. They are everywhere. You can't walk through a parking lot without someone taking your picture. And how long do they keep that data for, these private companies? So I'm struggling here. I was comfortable in committee with a 10-day limit. I'm not comfortable with 180. And I'm not comfortable. I think that this is a discussion that's going to be unfolding as we move into this into the new decades. There's so much technology out there right now. When we leave this building, if you wanted to get tracked, you can be tracked from this building to back to your office. It's there. And right now we're splitting hairs over law enforcement, but there's very little mention that's being paid to all of these private companies that are tracking every move we make. I would encourage this topic to be brought up in the near future, next session. Thank you.
The member from Dakota, Representative Atkins.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I wasn't trying to wave you off, but I just know that my seatmate back here in the back row had raised his hand before I did, so I appreciate you recognizing me as well. And folks, would the chief author of the amendment please yield?
She will yield. Representative Atkins.
And thank you, Representative Hillstrom, for that. When I was listening to the debate, and I came in, honestly, this is one of those issues I didn't know how I was going to vote. Oftentimes we walk in and we do know if we're a red or a green on a particular amendment. But in listening to the debate, as I was thinking about it, and Representative Cornish actually just made the point, if we substituted in telephone conversations for your amendment, that would concern me greatly. But it would be a very effective law enforcement tool if they could take all of our phone conversations and aggregate that and listen in on those and then hold them for 180 days. I think that would be a heck of a lot more effective than just using license plates. And that's what prompts my question. And my question is just simple, and I wasn't listening at the outset, but I assume that if law enforcement folks, 99.2% of the people that are in this data are innocent, and they're presumed innocent under this little document that some folks wrote a couple hundred years ago. Assuming that's the case, then I'm also assuming that in order for law enforcement to look at that information on innocent people, you've got to at least go to a judge and get a warrant and say, I've got some kind of, like Representative Mullery pointed out, there was a shooting at a particular home in Minneapolis, and we want to find out which license plates were near that home at a particular date on a particular time, so that they'd have some kind of basis for seeking to look at that very private information about where all these innocent people have been. There'd be a warrant required, right, under your amendment?
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and Representative Adkins. There is no warrant requirement in the bill. I'm simply changing the number of days that this data can be kept. Members, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy on your license plate on your car. You have an expectation of privacy sometimes inside your car, or inside your house, or on the telephone, but when you are out in the public, just as you're here, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy while you're sitting here because people in the gallery can view what you're doing. So someone could sit here and videotape what you're doing, as people do, take pictures of what we're doing, and there is nothing in the law that stops them from doing that because you're in a public place. When you're out on the street, when you're out in a neighborhood, when you're on the freeway, you see those traffic cams up above so that we can watch on the news whether or not there is too much traffic and we want to go a different way, or we're learning about a crash. You have no reasonable expectation of privacy when you're out in public driving around. Therefore, all this does is capture the license plate and the location. It doesn't capture who's driving the car. It doesn't capture anything that's going on inside the car. It captures the license plate and the location and the car. And that's it.
Representative Atkins.
And thank you, Representative Hillstrom, for clarifying that for me. But Representative Hillstrom, I do have an expectation that somebody's not going to follow me around. And that's precisely what this amendment does. That's why I just assumed that there needed to be some, in order to access and look at this data, there was some kind of protection. All you're doing is taking all of this. You've been following me. You've been following all these folks around and the license plates around. I think there is an expectation that we won't be followed around by the government. And I usually don't weigh in. In fact, I usually vote with the cops on just about everything. And I think most of the members in this body probably do. They do a great job. But this goes beyond the pale to following around 99.2% of innocent people and then just having access to it. Anytime and I understand it's Representative Johnson said, we'll only look at this info when we really have a reason to look at it. But under our core document under which this country was founded, we don't do that unless there's somebody says at the court level, judge level, that you really have a legitimate basis for doing so. So when you say we don't have an expectation of privacy for all those things, I think the point is we do have an expectation of privacy that we're not going to be followed around by the government. And that's what this does. So if the argument has convinced me that I'm, too, a red vote.
The member from Dakota, Representative Garofalo.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And just 2 points. For my friend, Representative Atkins, I hate to break the news to you. I would suggest you research what is called the Echelon Project. It is not a conspiracy theory. Actually, a lot of those calls are already recorded and stored. A lot of that data is out there, and I would just encourage you to read that. It's actually pretty scary. But I would like to point out to members that the greatest threat to democracy is the unbridled power of its citizens by the state, which, by the way, is always unleashed in the name of preservation or protecting us. And that's not an original quote. I got that from a West Wing episode a long time ago. So, but it is true. Whenever these encroachments, whenever these infringements come upon us, the argument has always meant that it's in our best interests. And certainly I don't question the motives of members on both sides of the aisle who support that, but this is some pretty scary stuff. And as somebody who works in technology and understands how easily this data can be obtained, collected, copied, I would just urge caution and would respectfully oppose the amendment before us.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, Representative Hillstrom said one thing correctly, that the correct standard here is not necessarily all the great things that we could do by tracking your movements or listening to your phone conversations or microchipping you. There's no question that that would be amazingly efficient and would solve all kinds of crimes. And if you're thinking, like the example presented by Representative Simonson, about a particular crime that you think is particularly horrendous and you would like to give the police more tools in order to solve that crime, ask yourself how many tools and what kind of tools. Because we're not talking here about the severity of any particular crime. We're talking about the standard that Representative Hillstrom mentioned, which is your reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, Representative Hillstrom said this is moot because you have no expectation of privacy about all the places that you've been every day. And that's not true. Members, that is not true. In January of 2012, the United States Supreme Court decided United States versus Jones. For those of you that remember, in 2011, this involved police in Washington, D.C. encroaching upon a vehicle to place a GPS device upon the vehicle of another individual. This went up through the Court of Appeals and ultimately the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said the cops got a warrant to do this, and that was okay. But they used information that was outside the parameters of that warrant. The warrant was limited to a certain amount of time within the parameters of the District of Columbia. They used information where that vehicle went into Maryland and outside the duration. So they said, this is an unwarranted search. The problem that the Supreme Court found was that the police actually encroached upon the vehicle to place the GPS device. And then they went in subsequently even to change the batteries that night when the guy was sleeping. So they said that was the problem there. So they didn't specifically address that portion of what we're talking about here. What they did say was that achieving the same result, this mass result of finding all kinds of different locations that you've been, by electronic means without an accompanying trespass, so not even trespassing on the car, may be an unconstitutional invasion of privacy, but the present case does not require us to answer that question. So it almost looks like in the dicta of the Supreme Court that's saying, yeah, tracking everywhere that you've been by electronic means may very well be an unconstitutional breach of your privacy because you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And members, this is important because what you decide today is what the Supreme Court will use in the next case to decide whether or not you have a reasonable expectation of privacy with this information. Because the Supreme Court decides what's happening. And all the examples that were used. Remember, I just went in and I shut off the GPS tracking on my phone. Just like that. Turn it off. Now the company doesn't know where I am. I can't do that with my license plate. And if I do, it gives probable cause for a police officer to pull me over right there anyway. You can't do that with government. With private industry, you have the option of who you choose for a carrier for your cell phone or who you use to call someone and whether or not you can shut that off. You can't do that with government. The legal standard here is specific. Reasonable expectation of privacy. Right now, you should have that expectation that you can freely travel without the government's eye in the sky knowing everywhere that you've been and aggregating that data. And the Supreme Court knows that too. That's why they said what they did in dicta in United States versus Jones. Now, as far as the issue raised, that if you're not doing anything wrong, well, you don't have anything to worry about, right? I mean, all those Tea Party patriot groups, they weren't doing anything wrong. So they shouldn't have anything to worry about. What's the big deal? Heck, Rosa Parks, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She didn't have anything to worry about, right? She decided she's going to sit in the front of the bus. How about a guy named John Lewis? A guy named John Lewis, who since 1987, he's been a member of Congress from Georgia's 5th District. But he's not famous because he's a congressman. He's famous because in 1961 he was beaten within an inch of his life by the Ku Klux Klan in cooperation with local law enforcement while he was a freedom rider in Birmingham, Alabama. He just got on the bus and he was riding. He didn't have anything to worry about, right? Because he wasn't doing anything wrong. In fact, the Supreme Court stated specifically that he has the right to be a freedom rider. There are countless examples of folks who weren't doing anything wrong, so they really shouldn't have anything to worry about. And as far as the issue that there's no way there's enough people to track me in all these locations, members, here's numbers straight from the St. Paul Police Department. There are over 200 closed-circuit TV cameras positioned at or near intersections on major corridors in the city of St. Paul. 116 marked police vehicles outfitted with in-squad camera systems. Not sure about other law enforcement agencies that operate in the St. Paul Metro Transit or State Patrol. Members, your license plate data is on file now. The police have where you have been in the city of St. Paul. Whether or not they park a squad on Aurora with the camera aimed at the entrance and exit to the SOB parking ramp. They have your data. In the month of June 2012 alone, 805,000 license plate images. Members, the City of Minneapolis Police Department has your data. They know where you've been. They can track it anywhere. If my wife wants to know where I've been, she can call her friends at the Minneapolis Police Department. They'll tell her if I go in Minneapolis. So this is not about all those matters. This is about your reasonable expectation of privacy. Remember, send a message to your constituents that you understand their privacy rights, and send a message to the U.S. Supreme Court the next time they track all the states of what the citizens reasonably expect. They'll know that Minnesota stands out as a place that expects privacy. Vote no on the Hillstrom Amendment.
Member from Hennepin, Representative Winkler.
Madam Speaker, members, 6 months is way too long. 0 is probably really too short. But a no vote on the Hillstrom Amendment will get us somewhere sensible in between.
The member from Waseca, Representative Petersburg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I also arise to oppose the Hillstrom Amendment. A wise man once told me, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think that's the situation here, that because we can keep it for 180 days, that we ought to. I think the framers of the Constitution have been very much opposed to intervention by the state in regards to infringement upon the civil liberties of the individuals. But one of the things I want to leave you with is this fact. What they're collecting in this license plate collection is not just your license plate. It is evidence. They are collecting evidence on each and every one of us. Because if it's not used as evidence, they wouldn't be needed. So the thing for you to remember is that we are being collected upon, and we need to protect our civil liberties in behest of our future. So thank you, and I appreciate a no vote on the Hillstrom.
The member from Dakota, Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to request a roll call.
Representative Holberg requests a roll call. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Representative Mullery, you do a great job representing your community, and as a freshman, I took the opportunity to do a ride-along in your district with the Minneapolis Police Department, and very quickly came to the conclusion that Dorothy wasn't in Lakeville anymore. Very different community with very challenging issues. And I have served with you for a number of years, and one of the issues that you have always really been concerned with as well is profiling. And this bill has no limits as to where these cameras, these readers can be placed. And I understand the need for safety in your district, but I am also thinking that you are probably concerned about the liberties and freedoms of your residents as well. And I am sure that you would not like to be in a position where 2 or 3 years from now we find that certain neighborhoods there are a proliferation of these readers in stationary locations, which is basically a surveillance primarily of the people in those neighborhoods. This is very dangerous technology if not used properly. And in this area, as public policymakers, what we need to do is balance the need for public safety and the rights of privacy. And I'm proud of Minnesota. Minnesota, for years, has had this little independence streak, and we were, I remember Representative Rukavina and many of us being dragged kicking and screaming to things like primary seatbelts, one of the last states. Our privacy laws around our medical records exceed the HIPAA standards because we care about the privacy rights of the residents of Minnesota. 180 days is 6 months of that information being available to law enforcement. And if I might just step back to the conversation that we had about 45 minutes ago about access to records. What if that employee at the DNR not only had access to the information about those 7,000 people that he looked up, but he also had access to their movements and whereabouts because it was there? We as public policymakers should limit the information we collect on our citizens, our law-abiding citizens, to only that which is necessary to conduct government services. And I understand the concern of law enforcement. I had an opportunity to have conversations with the Dakota County Sheriff and the Chief of Police in the city of Lakeville, and they were able to provide, Lakeville was in fact one of the first cities that piloted this technology, and provide me with some information on its limitations and uses. I don't believe 180 days is right, and Representative Hillstrom was a little off in her characterization of my bill, in that when it was introduced it was at zero storage. In my amendment in committee, I brought it to a 10-day storage period, and Chair Lesch successfully amended the bill back to zero storage. Members, I would strongly ask for a red vote on this amendment. 180 days is a long time to store this information. There are no guardrails, if you will, on how it can be used or accessed. And I just think that with the Senate at 90 days, I believe 90 days is too long. Maybe zero is not exactly right, but I would like to have the House have a strong showing against the 180-day standard. Please vote red.
Member from St. Louis, Representative Simonson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. I just want to make two final points here. And number one being, I think we really need to bring this back into the scope of what the amendment actually is. We're talking about allowing the data to be saved by law enforcement for a period of 180 days. We're not talking about drones. We're not talking about government oversight. We're not talking about conspiracy theories here. We're talking about allowing law enforcement to save license plate reader data for 180 days for nothing more than the simple ability to help them, give them a tool to solve crimes. Okay? My last point that I want to make is I'm going to stop advocating on behalf of law enforcement who really wants this as a tool. And I agree with that, and I'm going to support it by voting green. But I'm going to change my tactic, and I'm going to support the family of the girl that was kidnapped in Duluth, whose crime was solved because this data was available. It's very simple. There's nothing wrong with saving this data for 180 days. Nobody's going to be harmed. If you didn't do anything wrong and your data was collected, there's no harm done. And I say this because I'm comfortable giving this data and the access to this data for 180 days to law enforcement. And I want to make this very clear because it's important to me. In Transportation Policy Committee this year, we heard a bill about red light cameras, which I voted against. I voted against red light cameras for the simple reason that the data was going to a private company who was going to screen the information and then pass it along to law enforcement. And I thought that was wrong. If that data was going directly to law enforcement and that's where it was going to stay, that might have changed my vote. But I don't support that. I do support this amendment, and I encourage a green vote.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Mullery.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Representative Holberg, you said you went on a ride-along, but I've been on those ride-alongs where we get called to scenes where there's a kid there laying in the street dead because he's been shot by a gang. And please don't say that you're protecting the neighborhood people from some kind of information going out. I'm in meetings all the time where the neighborhoods meetings are requesting these cameras be brought to their neighborhoods, but there's not enough money to have them wherever they want them. They've requested hundreds of cameras, and you're protecting the people, supposedly you're saying, but they want this. They want it. So please don't get in the way of public safety. I've been at the homes of mothers when their kid was murdered by a drive-by shooting, which this would help cut down on. So please don't say that we're worried about some nebulous cop that's going to follow me or somebody else around.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members. Members, this has been a really thoughtful debate. It's gone far afield from my underlying amendment, and so I just really want to make sure that we bring this back. Members, currently law enforcement collects this data and keeps it, and there aren't restrictions. This bill puts the restrictions on it. And all I'm saying is while I can support the majority of Representative Holberg's bill, I can't support the 0 days. I believe that that ties the hands of law enforcement in their ability to do their job to protect us. These license plate reader data have provided members of our law enforcement community with very valuable information to solve these crimes that I talked to you about, and I'm not going to re-go through them. Members, if we want to have an opportunity this year to make certain that we put adequate restrictions on the use of this information and how much it's available to the public, we can do that. I don't think we can do that and have it become law this year at 0 days. So I strongly encourage you to support the 180 days and hope that between now and Monday we can come up with something that both law enforcement can support and we can support as people who want to protect the privacy of our citizens. Because if it doesn't become law this year, all of the information will be continued to be used, collected, without any restrictions by the state of Minnesota.
The clerk will take the roll on the amendment. The clerk will close the roll. Representative Swedzinski votes no. There being 39 ayes and 90 nays, the motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File 474, as amended.
Third reading, as amended. Member from Blue Earth, Representative Cornish.
Mr. Speaker and members, this is more of a statement than it is anything else to law enforcement. I know law enforcement is out there right now watching some of the monitors, some in uniforms. I would like you to learn something from this. Get on the right side of the people's issues sometimes. We had a little problem with law enforcement on the Second Amendment earlier in the year, and now again on some personal civil rights. So it really bothers me. We get the gang strike force problem a few years ago. All attention is focused on law enforcement. Then we get the problem with the data this year, looking into it. People are focusing on it again. Then we're talking about drones. We're talking about photocop. We're talking about cameras. Sometimes law enforcement, be careful what you put your name on paperwork and support. Remember the Norman Rockwell print of the cop in the blue uniform and the saucer cap sitting by the kid in the malt shop and answering questions. Let's kind of bring it back, and don't be suckered in by technology. Stand on the side of the people and the total Constitution that we took the oath to, and then you'll get people that making positive comments again instead of all the negative ones you've been hearing lately. And I said 99% of the cops are good and they do a great job, but I would just like to encourage law enforcement to get on the side of the people. I can't make it around all your conventions this year. You probably won't print my letters in your law enforcement magazines, but take a clue from what happened today. Thank you.
Discussion to the bill. The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesch.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Members, I want to thank Representative Holberg for doing the work that she did on this bill. As you can tell by the previous debate on Representative Hillstrom's amendment, that I feel strongly about this because, as I stated, this is a harbinger for what we'll be voting on. And no, it's not simply conspiracy theories and black helicopters. I remember Representative Rukavina sitting over there in the front row one at a time yelling over at Representative Holberg, Representative Holberg, we agree they're black helicopters. We just disagree on who the pilot is. And that was Representative Rukavina. The fact is, call it what you will, conspiracy theory, technology is changing so rapidly that I will guarantee you that within 2 years there will be a new level of technology that we will be debating on this floor. And again, law enforcement will come in and say they really need this tool. And in some cases, we'll give it to them. In some cases, we won't. For a very specific reason, members. I don't know how many of you read books by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. There are 2 books called On Killing and On Combat that go around in military circles. And he describes, there's a passage that military types and law enforcement types are very fond of, describing sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. And the protectors of society protect the sheep from the wolves, and those are the sheepdogs. And you try to give those sheepdogs as many tools as possible. And is this the case with any sheepdogs or any profession that feels strongly and passionately about their role in life and their identity? They start to see the solution to problems as those that benefit their profession. And many times that's true. But when your only tool is a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. And in this case, sometimes it's our job as the shepherds to ensure that even the sheepdogs are given appropriate rules so that not everything in their world starts to look like a wolf. That's our job, to ensure that those rules are kept. In the future, we may extend those abilities of law enforcement because of the technology, but for now, we need to keep it within the parameters of the Constitution. So thank you for your vote today. I ask you to vote yes on this bill to put us in a strong position going into conference.
Discussion to the bill. Representative Holberg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker and members, and I'll be brief, and certainly I appreciate the no vote on the Hillstrom amendment. I respect her concern and position, but I think that the public is aware of this issue. I think they care, and I think it puts us in a strong position going in to the Senate. Representative Lesch, early on in the session, I had received a number of calls from the media about, was somebody going to do this bill? And I've, given that the Democrats were in the majority, I deferred to you and kept asking, is somebody going to do this? Is somebody going to put a bill in? And at one point down in the parking ramp, he said, well, you should do it. And so I appreciate being able to do this. Members, this, again, the balance between privacy and public safety, we have to set the standards. With the issue of license plate readers, we are right back to where we were with the mileage study data. They got ahead of themselves. They didn't have the proper standards in place and had to go for a temporary classification. That temporary classification will expire. When it expires, everything is public. And so it's very important that we take the proper steps now to set the standards around this program. Representative Hillstrom mentioned private companies collecting this information. I've had conversations with a number of members, and I would look forward to a bill next year around the private collection of this information. I think that that should be regulated as well, and I would encourage a green vote. Thank you.
Representative Hillstrom.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And members, normally I wouldn't speak after the author. I really do think that we need to move off this 0 days, and I think that it should have looked more like 180 days. But I still think members should vote for this bill, and I just really wanted to make that clear. There are parameters that need to be in place to protect the public from the use of this data in proper ways. And so I didn't want members to think that just because my amendment didn't pass that I thought you should vote no. I really would encourage members to vote yes.
The clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 128 ayes and 4 nays, the bill is passed as amended and its title agreed to.